Cast out during Ramadan, a heartbreaking Islamic story of a forgotten mother. Ksitigarbha Tales. Outside, the Ramzan moon cast its silver light upon the quiet rooftops, as if veiling some deep secret. In a small house tucked within the densely populated neighborhood, the air carried no scent of warm rice nor the echo of prayers like in previous years. Instead, there was silence, an oppressive kind of silence, more frightening than any scream. In the back room of the house, an old woman, Halimah, sat curled in a dark corner. Her frail body was wrapped in a tattered blanket that had once been her wedding shawl. Cold wind slipped through the cracked door, bringing with it a strange chill, like a whisper of approaching sorrow. Outside the room, voices were rising. Mother, do you not understand, or are you just pretending? Saif, the eldest son, snapped in frustration. We can't afford to take care of you anymore. There's not enough food, we're behind on rent, and you just sit there observing Ramadan like you're some kind of royalty. Jafar, the second son, stood with his arms crossed, eyes emotionless. He's right, Mom. We work like oxen all day, then come home to cook, clean, and serve you. When Dad was alive, you at least respected him. Now, you're just a burden. Their wife, eyes glued to her phone, let out a loud and pointed huff. Halimah said nothing. She was used to their accusations. But today, something felt different. It wasn't the harshness of their words, it was their eyes. The same eyes she once cradled with lullabies now looked at her like a worn-out relic, misplaced in a house where there was no longer room for respect. My child, her voice trembled like dry leaves in the wind. I once scrubbed floors and washed strangers' clothes just to feed you all. I'm old now. I ask for nothing but a quiet corner to observe Ramadan in peace. Faith. Will your faith pay the electricity bill, Mother? Saif shouted, slamming a chair to the ground. The sound of wood cracking against tile shattered whatever respect remained. No one moved. No one reached out when Halimah struggled to stand. They just stood there, three strangers watching someone they used to love be exiled from their own home. The door shut. The clank of the iron latch echoed like a verdict. Halimah stepped out with her cane, her eyes blank, staring into the void ahead. The Ramzan wind was no longer gentle. It hit her face like a reminder that out there, the world had no place for an old mother past her time. She kept walking, directionless. Each shaky step clung to memories, the lullaby she once sang to Saif during a midnight fever, the way she had rushed to cradle Jafar when he tripped at school. But now, those sons had grown enough to discard their mother like a debt they no longer wished to carry. If you're still watching this video, and somewhere out there you've seen lives like Halimah's, please comment the number 5 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I suggest you do and turn on the bell so you don't miss the stories we bring you. Your support helps us keep creating content to inform and inspire. Nightfall. In a remote forest, far from any home, Halimah collapsed under a dying tree. Her heart pounded from exhaustion, her throat burned with thirst, her stomach empty since sunrise. But the worst pain was in her heart, a heart now crumpled like paper left in the rain. She looked up at the sky, tears dripping silently onto the cracked earth. Ya Allah! Is this the reward for all my years of selfless motherhood? I gave my whole life to my children. So why, in the end, am I the one left behind? Silence. A faint rustle came from behind the bushes. Halimah turned instinctively, gripping her cane. And then, she saw it, a large snake with piercing golden eyes slithering from the shadows. But she didn't run. Her eyes no longer held fear. She had already faced what was more terrifying than any beast, being abandoned by her own flesh and blood. The snake looked at her. It didn't move closer, didn't hiss. It just watched, almost as if waiting. Halimah sat down. The forest wind howled. The snake slowly turned and vanished into the grass. She exhaled, wondering if perhaps her fate wasn't sealed just yet. But she had no idea. From that very moment, something beyond the visible world had begun to shift. A thread between guilt and redemption, between curse and compassion was being woven, stitch by stitch, deep within the forest, from the heart of a mother who had no more tears to shed. That Ramadan sky turned a heavy shade of lead, as though the heavens themselves were fasting. The wind blew through the trees, carrying scents of wild herbs and forgotten time. Inside a crumbling hut with a rotting straw roof, Halimah curled up like an abandoned child. She didn't cry anymore, not because her tears had dried, but because her heart had hardened to the point where even sorrow couldn't find its way out. And then, something strange happened. There was a sound. Not of wild animals or snapping branches. It was gentle like footsteps, yet not quite human. The snake returned. In its mouth were a piece of dry bread and a few dates. It gently dropped them onto the ragged mat beside Halimah. She opened her eyes, half awake, thinking it was her final vision before death. "What is this?" she mumbled, her hand trembling as she reached for the old bread. The snake did not leave. It lay down beside her like a silent sentinel. She bit into the bread. It was dry, but in that moment it tasted more divine than any feast she had once cooked for her children. She wept. Not because she was fed, but because a snake, a creature so feared by mankind, was the only one who reached out to save her in her darkest hour. She looked up. "Ya Allah. I don't understand this. When my children turned away, you sent me, a snake. Is it to test my heart, or are you trying to heal it?" The snake said nothing. But in its golden eyes, those eyes that held no human tongue, there was something resembling mercy. As the sun disappeared, the distant call to Maghrib prayer echoed faintly, shredded by the forest wind. Halimah grabbed what little water remained in a wooden shell, whispered Bismillah, and bit into a date, breaking her fast with dignity. The snake crept closer. It did not eat. It simply watched like a companion, a witness to something sacred. Then Halimah stood, or tried to. She trembled, but she knelt on that dusty mat and raised her hands in prayer, offering namaz beneath the night sky. A strange image. A mother, abandoned, praying alone during Ramadan in a ruined forest hut, protected by a snake. And yet, somehow, the moonlight shone a little brighter in that moment. That night, Halimah fell asleep beneath the tree near the hut. The snake remained by her side. It began to rain. Forest rain is unlike city rain. It's colder, harsher, and it drowns everything. Halimah was soaked. Her body shook, lips turned blue, hands frozen stiff. And then, the snake returned. It brought nothing this time. But it coiled its body into a makeshift shelter, then gently guided her to a larger tree with thick leaves overhead, enough to shield her from the rain. She whispered, "You found me shelter." The snake bowed its head. A humble gesture, asking for nothing in return. In a moment of emptiness, Halimah suddenly thought, if a snake with no blood ties, no religion, no words can find shelter for me, then why can't the children born from my own body? The wind still blew. The rain still fell. But inside her heart, a storm raged far stronger. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the city, Saif and Jafar were feasting at a lavish banquet. Bright lights. Laughter rang out, mingling with the heavy scent of perfume. Around them, wine despite it being Ramadan, and unfamiliar women, many years younger than themselves. No one mentioned their mother. No one asked what she had eaten that day. They had told themselves, she was a burden. Now we're finally free. But a seed had been planted. In the night. In the forest. In tears. Something was waiting. Waiting for the right moment to rise. And deep within the forest, a snake stood guard over the sleep of a woman the world had cast aside. That night, as the rain faded, the forest returned to its haunting silence. But it was not peace, it was a breathless stillness, the kind that falls when all living things sense something unnatural is near. Halimah remained curled beneath the large tree, partially shielded by thick leaves, and partly by the warm body of the snake. A slow burning fever made her twitch in her sleep, but she stifled every groan for fear of disturbing the one soul who hadn't abandoned her. Then, a growl echoed through the woods. Not a wild dog. Not a fox. It was deeper. Hungrier. Bloodthirsty. From the underbrush, a shadow emerged. A large forest bear, its eyes glowing red under the moonlight, its wet fur matted with mud. Its belly sunken, it had clearly gone hungry for days. It sniffed. And then, it saw Halimah. To the bear, she was nothing but a fragile carcass. An easy meal. Halimah awoke not from the sound but from instinct. That primal sixth sense known only to mothers who have faced danger too many times. She opened her eyes and saw the bear. No strength to run. No place to hide. No one to call for help. Only faith. Ya Allah. If this is my end, please make it quick. I am not afraid to die. I only grieve that I never once saw my children regret. The bear roared. It stood on its hind legs and charged. Halimah closed her eyes. Not from fear but surrender. What could scare a woman more than being cast out by her own children? But then, a sharp, slicing hiss tore through the air. The snake. It launched like an arrow, striking the bear's neck right at the tender spot beneath the ear. The bear shrieked. It flailed madly. But the snake held on. An uneven battle between a small creature and a beast built for killing. But in every move the snake made, there was pure, reckless devotion. No calculation. No hesitation. As if it was willing to give everything just to protect someone who had nothing left. Halimah opened her eyes. She froze. She saw. The snake flung across the clearing. Blood splattered the leaves like red ink on white silk. The bear turned, ready to finish it. But the snake rose again. Its back bent. Its belly torn open. Yet it crawled back, dragging itself in front of Halimah. Why? She sobbed. The bear roared again. But this time, the forest trembled. It was not just a predator's growl. It was a sound that pierced the clouds. A sound that awakened something beyond this world where every curse born from pain is recorded. Halimah looked up. Her face was drenched in rain and tears. Ya Allah, if this blood is a sign from you. If I am the last mother you still hear. Then hear me now. If my children have torn this heart apart, then I ask you let their hearts tremble too, let them break, so they may one day understand a mother's pain. The curse had been spoken. No screaming. No fury. Just a plea. Whispered from the lips of a kneeling woman, beside a dying snake, and before a bear that fled not from strength, but from something it could never understand, loyalty. A cold wind swept the sky like an unseen hand accepting its task. Far on a distant hill, black clouds spiraled into a strange formation. A bolt of lightning flashed, no thunder followed, but the entire forest glowed for one haunting moment. The snake crawled back to her. Its blood dripped onto her hands. It could no longer coil up. It simply lay beside her feet like a child, exhausted, seeking its final warmth. Halimah bent down. And for the first time in her life, she kissed the head of a snake. If the world sees you as a demon, then to me, you are the angel Allah sent. That night, no one knew that a mother's heart had been saved not by her children, but by a creature with no voice, no status. Only pure, unshakable loyalty. And at that very moment, on the other side of the city, a terrifying dream had just begun to unfold for two heartless men. In the upper room of the once proud house, Saif threw himself onto a bed that had once made him proud. Blackwood frame, pristine white sheets, expensive cologne still lingering from nights of indulgence. But tonight, all luxury felt meaningless. For one simple reason, he couldn't sleep. At the same time, Jafar tossed and turned. Moonlight pierced the dusty window, making the room look like a morgue. The wall clock ticked slow, deliberate, each tick like a knock from another world. He pulled the blanket over his head, but the cold crept down his spine. He felt it. Someone was standing outside his door. 1 a.m. Saif drifted into a light sleep for a few minutes. And then he dreamed. In his dream, he walked through an old alleyway. On either side, houses stood without windows, without voices. Only one sound echoed, crying, soft, broken, repeating. Then, a door opened. A frail woman stood there, dressed in a worn brown dress, her face hidden beneath a scarf. She said nothing, just stared at him. Saif stepped closer. His hands trembled. He couldn't see her face, but somehow, he knew it was his mother. Mother, he whispered. She didn't respond. She simply raised her hand, a thin, pale hand, and pointed behind him. Saif turned around. A forest appeared. In the middle of it, a small hut. In front of the hut, a wounded snake lay motionless. And his mother praying in the rain, hair soaked, hands trembling as she lifted them, eyes tightly shut, lips moving in silent prayer. If my children forget me, let that forgetting follow them, like a shadow that never leaves their sleep. Saif jolted awake. He sat up straight, heart pounding like war drums. Sweat drenched him. The lights were still on. The TV still played soulless ads flickering across the screen. But he didn't dare close his eyes again. And Jafar? He dreamed of a well. At the bottom was a bound woman whispering, "Water, just a sip." He looked down, but instead of helping, he threw a stone. The woman looked up. Her face was their mother's. She didn't cry. She smiled. That smile like a blade tearing through his heart. He screamed in his dream, but no one heard. Then the well collapsed. And Jafar fell, the sound of her laughter echoing as he plunged. He woke up, frozen. The sun hadn't risen. But outside, the wind howled through the cracks, carrying a muffled sound like a weeping old mother in the distance. Jafar ran to Saif's room. "Brother, you dreamt of Mom too, didn't you?" His voice shook. Saif didn't answer. He sat on the bed, knees drawn to his chest, eyes hollow. A long silence. Then, Saif finally turned to him. His voice was hoarse. Something's not right. Since we drove her out, this house doesn't feel like ours anymore. The next morning, it became even clearer. A teapot shattered on its own, no one touched it. Rats scurried in the kitchen though none were ever seen before. And then the faucet. Water poured out, blood red. It happened just as Saif went to wash his face. They looked at each other. They both understood. The curse had begun. But what they didn't know was this. It wasn't a curse born from demons. It was the soul force of a mother's broken heart. Rejected, crushed, banished to the edge of human decency. And still praying for her children's awakening. If you're still watching this video and praying for these two lost souls to find their way, please comment the number 8 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I encourage you to do so and turn on the bell. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content to inform and inspire you. On the other side of the forest, Halimah had just woken up. That night she hadn't dreamed. No bears. No snake. Only a piece of clear sky. Where two tiny children walked hand in hand through a field of lotus flowers, calling her mother. That morning, before the first rays of sun reached the city, Saif stood in the bathroom, splashing water on his face. The water was cold but his skin burned. He rubbed his eyes. Looked into the mirror. And then something impossible happened. In the foggy mirror, staring back at him wasn't his face. It was his mother's Halimah, her eyes sunken, her hair long and dripping, and a dark wound spreading from her forehead. He screamed. Stumbled backward, collapsed to the floor. His breath was ragged, his palms icy like he had touched a tombstone. Jafar rushed in, hearing the crash. He looked in the mirror, he saw nothing. But Saif couldn't look again. You're hallucinating, Jafar said. But in his heart, he was uneasy. Because since the night before, his fingernails had started to grow uncontrollably. And his skin had begun to change. That evening, they both noticed their skin had become rough, scaling, peeling like snake's hide. When sunlight touched them, their hands itched and burned. They went to the doctor. But the diagnosis shocked even him. Your bodies are reacting as if to a strange kind of poison. But it's not a virus. Not bacteria. It's as if karma is eating away at you. They scoffed. Thought it nonsense. But that night, things became crystal clear. The lights in the house went out. The room plunged into darkness. The TV still hummed, then faded like someone was strangling the sound itself. Jafar stepped into the hallway. He saw a faint light at the far end, the room that used to be their mother's. He walked toward it. His hands trembled. His knees wobbled. He reached for the doorknob. Turned it. The room was empty. Nothing but cold, dusty space. And the stale scent of dried tears. Then he heard it. A soft shuffling like someone dragging a cane. Then, breathing. Then, a quiet recitation almost like a lullaby. He turned around. And saw his mother. Sitting cross-legged in the hallway. Eyes shut. Lips moving. Sweat trickling down her brow. Jafar screamed. But it was like his own mind held his mouth shut. No one heard. At the same time, Saif screamed too. Not from what he saw, but from what touched him. His back clawed open. Not by hands. Not by beasts. But by his blanket. It shredded on its own like claws hidden in every fiber. Each rip left a mark on his back. Blood welled up. as if the blanket bore the weight of a mother's pain finally snapping. Then, one night, they both heard a knock. 3 knocks. Knock. 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 No one dared open the door. But it creaked open on its own. Outside, the sky was pitch black. No one stood there. Only their mother's headscarf caked with mud and blood lay neatly across the doorstep. Saif broke down in tears. For the first time since Halimah had left, he cried not from fear, not from pain, but from regret. "Mother, can you hear me? I was wrong. If you're still alive, please forgive me." But those words came too late. Too late for a mother now cradling a dying snake deep in the forest. Instead of being cradled by her own children. Far away in the forest, Halimah suddenly felt a sharp pain in her chest. She placed her hand over her heart. "Why does it feel so heavy?" she whispered to the snake. The snake didn't respond. But it looked at her with watery eyes. As if it had just heard someone crying on the other side of the woods. And somewhere, between two worlds, a whisper echoed not from a human mouth. A mother does not need perfect children. She only asks that they not turn into enemies of compassion. The next morning, Jafar woke up covered in scratches. As if he had crawled through brambles in his dreams. Saif's whole body was bruised as if something had squeezed him all night long. No more arrogance. No more excuses. They stood, looking at each other, fear in their eyes, but for the first time ever. The image of their mother reflected in both of them. "Brother, we have to find her," Jafar said, his voice cracking. Saif nodded. For the first time, without argument. They didn't know where to go. No one in the neighborhood had seen their mother since the night she was driven out. Neighbors once comforted by Halimah's soup during their own sickness now looked away. No one wanted to get involved in the affairs of sons who abandoned their mother during Ramadan. But then, a young street vendor ran up and tugged on their sleeve. "I saw the old lady walk into the forest behind the hill a few nights ago. It was raining hard, but she didn't come back." They looked at each other. The forest behind the hill. A name never spoken since childhood. They remembered, their mother once said, "Never step into that forest. That is where oaths become real." They left. No preparations. No gear. Only regret clawing at their hearts like the nails of time. The first step into the forest, nothing happened. But by the 10th step, Saif felt a cold wind blow against him, though the sun was shining. By the 20th step, Jafar began to hear whispers from beneath the earth. "Mother is still sitting here. Mother is still waiting for you. But do you dare look into her eyes again?" The trees grew thicker. The path behind them seemed to close. No way back. Then they crossed a shallow clearing. Saif collapsed. The ground beneath him. The very same place their mother had once lain in the cold rain. A snake coiled silently around her feet like a mute bodyguard. No one spoke. They kept walking. In the heart of the forest, they met an old hunched man. He leaned on a silver cane, standing at a forked path that led nowhere. "Who do you seek?" he asked, his voice like wind through ashes. "Our mother," Jafar whispered. The old man studied them. Then sighed. "If you are sons who have repented, then cross the broken bridge ahead. But if your hearts still harbor pride, the forest will claim your bodies as proof." The bridge was an ancient tree trunk, spanning a deep gorge. Below, thorns and snakes twisted like shadows. Saif trembled. Jafar turned pale. But they didn't stop. Step by step. Each step a wound torn open in memory. Step 1. They remembered their mother waiting at the table while they played outside. Step 2. Her trembling hand begging for medicine money only to be brushed aside. Step 3. Her figure sitting alone in darkness, so her children could study under the light. On step 4, Saif slipped. But Jafar grabbed his hand just like their mother once did when they nearly fell from the porch as children. They made it across. As they touched solid ground, the old man vanished. Only his voice remained. A mother's love has no form. But those who betray it will be shaped by the form of their own sins. In the distance, a tiny hut appeared. Smoke drifted from a smoldering pile of straw. Inside, a woman sat in prayer. Beside a motionless snake. In front of the hut deep within the forest, Saif and Jafar stood frozen. Their hair disheveled, clothes torn by brambles, faces pale with exhaustion and guilt. But when they saw the frail figure of their mother sitting by the fire, head bowed. The once proud sons looked like lost little boys. Halimah did not turn around. She continued whispering something, perhaps a verse, perhaps a prayer. Or perhaps just the names of her trembling sons standing behind her. Saif stepped forward. But the moment his foot touched the soil near the hut, a sound tore through his mind like a blade slicing through the shell of pride. He fell to his knees. Not because anyone forced him, but because the weight of guilt in his heart was now too heavy for his legs to carry. Jafar followed close behind. He tried to say mother, but his throat tightened, as if an invisible hand had gripped it. He simply bowed his head. Tears streamed down, not in sobs, but in silence. A silence more painful than any scream. Halimah slowly turned around. Her face had grown thinner. Hair white as snow, falling like ash over her shoulders. But her eyes held no blame, no contempt, only a weariness carved deep into her soul. She didn't stand. Didn't embrace them. Didn't say, "I'm okay." She only asked, her voice barely a whisper, like wind brushing moss. "So, you've finally come back." Saif collapsed in tears. He clung to his mother's legs as if holding on to a fading piece of life. Mother. I was wrong. I was a disgrace. If Allah punishes me, He is right to do so. But please, don't look at me with those eyes. Jafar dropped to his knees, his face pressed against the dirt. I heard your voice in my dreams, mother. Every night, it pulled me out of sleep. I saw you walking in the rain, carrying the years we threw away on your back. Halimah said nothing. But slowly, she lowered her hands onto both their heads. Her palms calloused, trembling but still warm, like the old days when she lulled them to sleep. A moment of sacred silence. The fire crackled softly. The snake beside her stirred one last time, then stretched out still, its eyes dimming under the twilight. Halimah gently stroked its head, a farewell to a friend who had walked through the storm with her. Then, she looked to the sky and whispered, "Ya Allah, if you've brought my children back with hearts that know remorse, then I have nothing left to complain about." She turned to them. You were once my flesh and blood, but you also became blades, driven into my heart without mercy. I have forgiven you. But forgiveness does not mean forgetting. Both sons bowed their faces to the ground, unable to meet her gaze. Saif, voice pleading. Please, give us a chance. We'll take you home. We'll repent. I promise I will spend the rest of my life making up for every tear you shed because of me." Jafar added, speaking fast, as though time might run out. "You were the sky we burned down. Now all we ask is that you let the clouds return." And Halimah cried. For the first time in many days, she cried. Not from pain, but because her heart had finally heard two words she had waited for in hopeless silence. True remorse. She lifted her hands to the sky and prayed, "Ya Allah, I don't ask for palaces, nor vengeance. All I ask is that you rain upon my sons' barren hearts, as you once rained upon mine, with the light of forgiveness." If you are still watching this video and wish to join in thanking Ya Allah, please comment the number 9 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I encourage you to do so and turn on the bell. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content to inform and inspire. In the forest, the wind stopped. The trees grew still, as if the world paused for a moment too sacred to disturb. As Halimah stepped out of the forest, the sun rose behind the mountains. No more winds like knives. No more laughter echoing from the shadows. Only the rustling of dry leaves beneath the feet of a mother who had weathered the storm. And her two sons, walking behind her like toddlers learning to walk all over again. The old house appeared. Once a symbol of pride, now empty and broken. The roof caved in. The front door hung off its hinges. Weeds sprouted through cracks in the walls. The stone bench where Halimah once sat knitting clothes for her sons, broken in two, buried under leaves. Saif looked up, his throat tightened. Jafar whispered, "We lived here like we'd never die. But Mom died a little every day inside this home." The three stepped inside. The house reeked of mold, dust, and something nameless, like the stench of time itself rotting. Halimah said nothing. She walked into the kitchen. Once alive with fire and steam. Once a place where she cooked rice porridge from a single handful of grain. She gently ran her hand across the counter. Dust clung to her fingers. She turned to her sons. "Clean it." No command. No scolding. Just two words. And yet, Saif and Jafar moved instantly, as if they had waited a lifetime for that order. The first day of redemption began. Saif rolled up his sleeves and lifted shattered bricks from the backyard, sweat soaking his back. Jafar removed rotted tiles, patching the roof with old wooden planks. And Halimah? She scrubbed each window, washed every old rug, and opened the Qur'an. She read softly, like a breeze in the morning. But to her sons, it echoed like a bronze bell in hearts weighed with guilt. That evening, Saif approached his mother. He knelt and handed her a scarf. It was her old headscarf, the one stained with blood the day she was shoved into the street. I kept it. I don't know why. Maybe, to remind myself that one day I'd have to face how low I had fallen. Halimah took it. She said nothing. But she never let go of that scarf again. That first night, the kitchen fire burned again. No feast. Just a pot of vegetable soup, some brown rice, and 3 chipped porcelain bowls. Jafar picked up the last piece of vegetable and offered it to his mother. Halimah returned it to Saif. Saif placed it in Jafar's bowl. And then, all three laughed. A laugh, filled with tears. Night fell. For the first time in years, the sound of Qur'an recitation echoed from the center of the home. Halimah sat in the middle, her 2 sons beside her, not wild young men anymore, but 2 once lost souls, now vowing to guard the gate to their mother's heart. Jafar whispered, Mother, do you think Allah has truly forgiven us? Halimah stroked his hair, answering with a voice as soft as a cloud. My son, Allah does not need to prove himself. But he always watches. And whoever turns back, every step becomes a silent apology. And the one who cries for their mother, those tears are signs of paradise. Outside, the moon shone bright. A snake coiled near the front porch. No one knew why it came, but Halimah once said, it was sent when the world rejected compassion. That night, as Halimah fell asleep, a gentle smile curled on her lips. Not because happiness was complete, but because she knew the seeds of goodness had returned to bloom in the hearts she once feared were gone. The next morning arrived quietly, like the day's first whisper. Light crept through the cracks, resting on the sleeping face of an old mother. For the first time in years, Halimah's sleep wasn't broken by sighs, wind, or shattered dreams. She dreamed of something simple. Two little boys, one wearing a patched-up shirt, the other barefoot, racing to pick up fallen leaves, stacking them like shingles to make a roof. Every time a leaf fell, they cheered. Mama won't be cold anymore. When she awoke, she realized it wasn't just a dream. Out in the yard, Saif struggled to stretch a plastic tarp over the roof. Jafar cleared out the overgrown garden, pulling weeds and digging drainage channels. No one told them to. No one needed to. They simply acted. When Halimah stepped outside, Saif bowed his head. We don't know how to cook your oat porridge. But I tried today. It's a bit burnt. Jafar, his hands covered in flour, added. And this is my first time baking date-filled bread. If you don't mind some ash and sand, it might be edible. Halimah watched her sons bustle around the kitchen, their hands clumsy, their backs soaked with sweat. And her heart softened, like a towel wrung dry from a storm and left under morning sun. She didn't eat right away. She picked up the blood-stained scarf from that fateful night, and used it to gently wipe their hands. I can eat anything now. As long as you season it with repentance. The mother began to tell stories. As she sat by the fire, Halimah recounted the days she worked as a maid during Ramadan. Stomach aching from hunger, yet cooking feasts for others. She told them how, when Saif was gravely ill, she sold her wedding earrings, her only keepsake from youth, to buy his medicine. She spoke of the day Jafar was expelled. And she walked 10 kilometers to plead with the principal, not with money, but with a mother's tearful eyes. The two sons fell silent. Jafar lowered his head. Why didn't you ever tell us these things? Halimah smiled. Not with blame. Not with pain. But like a verse from the Qur'an itself. Because I didn't want you to live under a burden of guilt. I tell you now. Because you've begun to repay me. Not with tears. But with your hands and feet. The second day passed. And the house warmed up. Not from material things. But from the heat born where repentance and mercy meet. That night, they read the Qur'an together. Halimah in the center. Saif on her right. Jafar on her left. The sons hung on every word. Suddenly, Saif broke into tears at verse 86. Jafar reached for his hand. Halimah placed hers over both. If tears are the signs of life, then today, I know my sons are alive again. That night, no one dreamed of snakes. No eerie laughter in the wind. Only one sound lingered in each of their hearts. Subhanallah, softly repeating. The next morning, the three went to the market. No one recognized them. The man once addicted to luxury now wore a simple brown tunic, humbly asking for wilted vegetables to replant the garden. The man who once worshipped money now helped an old woman cross the road with no thought of reward. And the mother once thrown out the front door now walked back into people's hearts, with quiet kindness. Someone said, "That's the family whose mother was once cursed by her own children, but forgave them with the same heart they had crushed." On the third morning after their return, real light came into their home. Not just sunlight piercing through the newly patched roof, but light from small acts, a glass of water offered with both hands, a whispered thank you, a softened gaze. But as Halimah always said, the road of repentance is not always straight. There are curves. And within those curves, faith is tested. That afternoon, a strange man appeared at the gate. Wearing a suit, holding a leather bag, with a lazy smile hiding sharper motives. It was Hashim, Saif's old business partner. The one who once led him into illegal deals. Saif. "My God, I thought you were dead," he laughed, slapping his shoulder. Saif froze, as if someone had ripped the bandage off an unhealed wound. "I've got a deal. Fast cash. No strings. I remember you sharp, slick. Don't tell me you're actually digging in the dirt now." Jafar heard it. He stepped outside, gaze firm. "My brother doesn't deal with people like you anymore. Leave." Hashim sneered. "Oh, so now you're his bodyguard, huh? I heard you two bow to that old hag all day now. The same one you kicked into the street." Saif clenched his fists. Every muscle tensed, instinct pushing him to throw a punch. Just then, Halimah stepped out. She said nothing. Just stood there, her back hunched, her eyes sunken, but with more authority than any weapon could wield. Hashim stepped back. Her gaze tore through the smirk on his face like a blade slicing silk. When a mother is thrown away, a son may still return. But when a man who profits from others' blood is looked straight in the eye, he realizes he's been dead inside all along. Hashim left without another word. Jafar exhaled. Saif stood still, sweat glistening on his forehead. Halimah turned back inside, no scolding, no anger. She simply said, "The first test always comes early. Not to knock you down, but to ask, are you truly standing up? Or just changing posture while lying down?" That night, they skipped dinner. They sat silently beneath the mango tree out back, the one Halimah had planted when her husband was still alive, back when Saif couldn't even say father. Jafar spoke. "I wanted to hit him, mother. But when you stepped out, I realized I don't need to protect you with violence. I need to protect you with my strength." Saif added. I almost said yes. Part of me still craves money, and that feeling of power. But then, I remembered how you looked at me that first night I returned. I don't want to lose that gaze again. Halimah nodded. If you can conquer yourselves, no one out there can ever defeat you. That night, Halimah dreamed again. Not of storms or blood. She dreamed of lying in a field of white daisies. Saif and Jafar sat on either side, both wearing white scarves, holding nothing but a bundle of green rice stalks. She smiled. Her heart was weightless. The next morning, the brothers woke early. They prepared a vegetarian meal and brought it to the home of a widowed beggar woman at the end of the street. The same woman they once mocked in their youth. No one knew. No one filmed it. Because true repentance needs no audience. It only needs to be lived. That morning, as white clouds blanketed the hills and birdsong carried through the air, Halimah sat alone on the small stone bench behind the house. The breeze was light. The sky clear. The air smelled of early season neem blossoms and freshly cut grass. But in her heart, something felt different. Very different. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sorrow. It was peace. A strange kind of peace. As if every breath was gently being unraveled from a tangled thread. Each knot loosened. Not with pain. Only with slowness. She looked up at the sky. And there it was. A teardrop-shaped black cloud, suspended in the clear blue, unmoving, neither breaking nor drifting. She knew. The time had come. That afternoon, Halimah called her sons. There was no drama. No tears. Just an ordinary noon, under the shade of the mango tree. I have something to say, she said gently. Saif and Jafar sat down. Their hearts stung with unease. Some instinct whispered that something was about to end. Halimah spoke slowly, each word carved into the air. My sons. I once thought forgiveness was something for grown ups. But now I understand. Forgiveness is the blessing of the one who's been hurt. They said nothing. I forgave you the night you cast me out. Not because you deserved it, but because I didn't want to carry a heavy heart into the grave. Jafar's hands trembled. He looked at her, mouth open but voiceless. Saif held her hand. Mother, please don't say that. We haven't done enough. We want to be with you, until you're truly old and weak. Halimah placed her hand over his wrinkled, clipped nails, slightly trembling, still warm. My dear. I've already passed through old and weak. Now. I'm going somewhere you cannot follow. At least, not yet. She handed them a folded white cloth. It was her burial shroud. Neatly kept. Clean. She had saved for it during her days as a maid, setting aside coins, bit by bit. If one morning I don't wake, don't rush to call anyone. Let me rest a while longer. So I can hear you reciting Qur'an for me. That is the final gift I ask. They wept. Jafar choked out. Mother, you just came back into our lives. Halimah smiled, as gently as a breeze at the end of a season. No, my sons. It is you, who have just come back into your own lives. I was only a bridge. A bridge never needs to last forever. As long as it takes you to the other side. That night, Halimah did not eat. She drank a small cup of water, lay on her familiar bamboo bed, turned her face to the wall, and sighed, not from weariness, but as if she were exhaling the last of a former life. Saif and Jafar stayed beside her. They didn't leave. They recited the Qur'an slowly, each word pouring into their hearts like sacred rain. At midnight, a gentle rain began to fall. The air cooled. The sound of raindrops tapping on the rooftop was soft, like someone knocking with loving fingers. Halimah still lay there, her eyes closed. Perfect peace. No labored breath. No trembling. No tears. And just before dawn, she did not wake. There was no wailing. No dramatic cries. Only the sound of Qur'an flowing from the mouths of her two sons. The ones who had once cast her away. Now sending her off with hearts utterly transformed. That morning, as the sun rose, a single ray of light pierced through the mango tree, falling gently on the face of the mother who now lay still. As if heaven offered one final blessing to a heart that had lived the full measure of motherhood, and departed with not a single trace of hatred. Saif and Jafar knelt beside her bed. No sobbing. No despair. Just a heavy silence, like their hearts were breaking open, piece by piece. They took the shroud she had prepared. With trembling hands, they smoothed her hair, washed her face. Jafar whispered, "Mother, if you can still hear us, know that we will live the rest of our lives as men who were born again by you." The funeral was simple. No large tent. No extravagant flowers. Just the poor neighbors Halimah had once helped. With a bowl of rice, a pinch of salt. Now coming quietly, hands clasped, eyes glistening. An elderly man stood and said to all, "I once saw these sons drive their mother into the street. I thought her life would end in silence. But no. She returned not to survive, but to awaken. And she succeeded." As Halimah's body was lowered into the earth, light rain fell again. A strange kind of rain. Not noisy, not harsh. Just gentle. Like someone was watering the grave with love that had come home. Saif and Jafar took handfuls of soil, covering her slowly. Not rushed. Each scoop was like a written apology spoken by their hands, not their mouths. When the mourners left, they stayed alone by the grave. Saif said, "I used to think, losing a mother meant losing a person. But now I know. It's losing an entire world we once refused to enter." Jafar added, "I once dreamed of mansions and cars. But now, I just wish I could hear her cough once more from the kitchen." They looked at each other. Nothing more needed to be said. 1 week later, Halimah's house became a free porridge kitchen every Friday. Cooked by Saif and Jafar themselves. They refused payment. They hung a wooden sign at the gate. "Mother's Kitchen, if you're hungry, come in." The story of the mother who was cast out and returned to forgive spread through the neighborhood, then the province. Not as a scandal, but as a quiet legend, woven gently into real life. Some asked, "Why not build a beautiful tombstone for her?" Saif smiled and replied, "She doesn't need stone. She carved her name into our hearts." That Ramadan's end, for the first time ever, 2 men knelt side by side and recited the Qur'an all through the night. No cameras. No social posts. Because they knew. The most beautiful prayers are the ones made without an audience. Just as their mother once prayed for them her whole life. In silence. And from then on, whenever it rains gently at dawn during Ramadan, the neighbors say to one another, "Halimah is visiting her sons again." Thank you for joining us today. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share one thing this story taught you, and how you'll carry it into your life. Your voice matters. Reading your reflections brings strength, healing, and inspiration to us all. If this story moved your heart, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us continue crafting stories that awaken the soul. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.